be hearing a lot about this particular issue in the next 5 to 6 hours. Mr. McManus, there's long lectures preparing. Our goal is to get 1 million copies of this issue out in the hands of the American people by July 4th. We're about halfway there now, because we need everybody to get involved to get these issues out. So we made these available for $1 a piece. The cover price is $2.50. And this, by the way, is what we did is we took out all the ads and we put more information in. So this originally came out September 15th and is now a special issue. It's an undated special issue. $1 a piece, 10 copies for $8, and cases of 100 for $80. I do have only a few cases on hand, but I can easily order them for you, or give you credit, put it on a credit card, a check, or what have you. For those of you who want to get involved in our educational efforts, we encourage you to join tonight. And there's applications on the back there as well. We have plenty of literature in addition to the magazines. We have books, several books written by Mr. McManus, which he'll be happy to autograph once he finishes his program. There will be no formal question and answer session, but Mr. McManus will be happy to stick around to answer any questions you have off the podium. There's also a couple of donation plates in the back on the side. We can't sell tickets because it's a public building, but we know that we have expenses, so if you would like to help out with those expenses, please put something in. If we were to sell tickets, we would have to charge about $5 to $10. Free parking too, it would have been an extra $20 if it was most events. And for those of you who do not like what you hear tonight, you are not allowed to take any money out of the plate. That's the whole stipulation. Mr. McManus is the president of the John Birch Society. When I first met this man in 1988, I was at the time the headquarters of our society was in Belmont. I had my oldest daughter at that time. She was about 3.5 years old. And I went into his office, his nice book-lined office with his Marine flag and his U.S. flag, and I was very impressed. And he gave me a very stern look, and he said to me, "Some world we're leaving here, aren't we?" Meaning, of course, my daughter. And I said, that's one of the reasons why he joined this organization. Mr. McManus is a native of Greater Boston, grew up in New York City, went to school at Holy Cross, and became an engineer, spent a few years in the Marine Corps. Got involved with the Birch Society, and since the mid-60s, he's been on the staff. He became president of the John Birch Society in the early 90s, early 1991. He is the publisher of the New American magazine. He is a frequent guest on numerous talk shows, including C-SPAN, and they didn't show up tonight, but we were hoping they would. He's been on the Larry King Show. He's been on countless hundreds of talk shows over the last 25 or so years. And what else does he do? Well, he's married, and he's a grandfather as well. I want to ask you all to give him a very warm welcome, Mr. McManus.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Hal. I got here a little late. I thought the program was at 7:30. In fact, I told some people to come at 7:30, so there'll be some more folks coming, and including my wife, who's going to really give it to me for this one. They always tell you that you're supposed to start off programs with a little bit of a levity, warm up the audience or something. I don't know, maybe some of you have heard me tell the story about the young fellow who came home from Sunday school class, and he was all excited. And he said to his mother, "Boy, they really gave us, what a lesson today." She said, "Tell me all about it, tell me all about it." So he said, "Well, it was a story about the time that the Jewish people were being chased out of Egypt by the Pharaoh and his army, and they were getting away and they were doing okay, but then pretty soon the army started catching up to them, and then they got up against the sea and they couldn't get across the sea, and the army kept coming down on them, and they were really in trouble. So he says, so Moses got on his walkie-talkie and he called in the Israeli Air Force. They bombed the army, and then the Navy came across the sea, picked them up, and took them to safety." And his mother looked at him and she said, "Is that what they told you in Sunday school?" And he said, "Well, no, Mom, but if I told you the way they told me, you wouldn't believe it." See, the boy didn't believe something he should have. And don't we find ourselves in that situation today in our country? There are many, many things that we try to tell people, and they just look at us and say, "No, that just can't be," and they turn around and walk away. Happily, there are more people listening today than there have ever been, and the credibility of the John Birch Society continues to grow, as it certainly should have over many, many years. It's taken a lot of effort on the part of a lot of very good people to just stand their ground. And usually when somebody stands his ground and won't move, then pretty soon he starts to attract people. And I guess you could say that about the John Birch Society. It's something that we're very proud of. We don't bend with the wind. We're not like the politicians. We don't try to appeal to people based on what they want to hear. We want them to listen to what they need to hear. Now here tonight we're going to talk about conspiracy. And conspiracy is a word that gets people to roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders and just look at it as if, no, this just can't be. But what is a conspiracy? Let's define the term. A conspiracy is an endeavor engaged in secretly by two or more persons for the accomplishment of an evil goal. So there's three elements. There's more than one person, there's secrecy, and there's evil. Now, if you have two of the three, you don't have a conspiracy. Some of you know about a famous book that was written back in the 60s by a man named Carroll Quigley, where he described a secret society whose goal was to rule the world. He never used the word conspiracy because he didn't believe it was evil. And yet it was a secret society to rule the world. He, in fact, was Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University. And we know that because that's what Bill Clinton told us. And that's one thing we believe of Bill Clinton. So we live at a time when the very word conspiracy sets people's eyes rolling and shrugging their shoulders. And yet conspiracies have existed all throughout history. Read Shakespeare, you'll read conspiracy. Go back to Holy Scripture, you'll find conspiracy. St. Paul urging the Romans, the night is past, the day is at hand, let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. What's he talking about there? Conspiracy. He told the people of Ephesus, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. One of the quotations that I've used over many, many years is a quotation from J. Edgar Hoover, who in 1956, you could say he was at the height of his popularity, maybe, the height of his effectiveness, fighting the communist movement within our country. He wrote an article for the Elks magazine, and in it he said, the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. Well, that's where we are today. Now, I don't contend that J. Edgar Hoover had the same view of conspiracy that I do. I think mine is a little more grand. What I see is in fact, a lot worse than he ever talked about. And so we're going to talk about a conspiracy actually that began in the 18th century. The conspiracy of the Illuminati, hatched in Bavaria on May 1st of 1776. We're going to try to trace this all the way through the 1800s up until our own time, because we believe that what we're facing in our country today and what the world faces, what mankind faces, is a conspiracy just like the Illuminati, if not actually an extension of it, that has continued down through 6, 7 generations. So as they sometimes say, fasten your seatbelts, we're in for a long ride. The John Birch Society was launched in 1958. Long before 1958, however, there were others speaking out about this very same conspiratorial organization, the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt. For instance, a lengthy editorial appeared in the Boston-based Christian Science Monitor in June of 1920. I usually have a copy of that with me. I don't know if I brought it. Let's see if I have it here. I think the last time I spoke, somebody asked me for it, and I gave it to them, but I have another one at home. Nevertheless, it's a lengthy editorial. It's 2.5 pages of this kind of type. And what they talked about in this editorial were remarkably disturbing events of the day. Again, now, this is 1920. And the editorial made reference to an exceptional book exposing the Illuminati that was written in 1798 by an Englishman named John Robison. I have a copy of that book here, something that's been republished by the John Birch Society. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robeson, written in 1798 about the Illuminati conspiracy that was formed on May 1st of 1776. Now, what did they say in 1920 in this editorial in the Christian Science Monitor? Here's what part of it. What is important to dwell upon is the increasing evidence of a secret conspiracy throughout the world for the destruction of organized government and the letting loose of evil. Anybody who will turn for a moment to the outpourings of Adam Weishaupt and his Illuminati may satisfy himself of that. John Robeson, who studied the gyrations of this order in France and Germany, has summed up its ideals as the obliteration of Christianity, the deification of sensuality, the proscription of property, the abjuration of all religion and morality, the repudiation of marriage, and as a necessary corollary, the state adoption of children, universal license, and the wrecking of civilization and giving over of society to general plunder. The Monitor editorialist claimed that the Illuminati's program included political degeneracy, manipulation of the people's thinking, even the propagation of evil for the sake of evil. And to those who might scoff at such a notion, the writer stated in 1920, when his work appeared, that the existence of, quote, the conspiracy of evil against humanity is entirely undeniable. And ladies and gentlemen, I believe it is no less deniable as the 20th century winds to a close. The goals of this conspiracy, noted in the 1920 editorial, are being realized. Our Christian-style civilization is being obliterated. Sensuality is being deified in books, magazines, movies, and television. Property rights are being eroded, religion and morality are under attack, marriage is being denigrated, and numerous government programs have been instituted to gain control of children. In addition, the threat of world government being built on the ashes of all of this destructiveness is very real. More commentaries such as this exist. In February 1920, Winston Churchill wrote an article for London's Illustrated Sunday Herald. Now, we don't accept all of the assertions made by Churchill, but he gave evidence of having a solid understanding of this Illuminati conspiracy when he referred to Adam Weishaupt, its founder, as Spartacus. As John Robeson and others have pointed out, members of the inner core of the Illuminati chose code names for themselves. Weishaupt's choice was Spartacus, the name of the leader of a slave revolt that kept ancient Rome in terror for 3 years. But what did Churchill write in 1920? Here it is. He said, from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, down through Trotsky in Russia, Béla Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, Germany, Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development has been steadily growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. That's very key. That was his attitude. It's my attitude. And now at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people. He's talking, of course, about the fact that the communists, the Bolsheviks, had seized control of Russia. He called them extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America. But weren't Lenin and Trotsky Russians? Yes. But were they financed by Europe and America? Yes, indeed they were. Note that Churchill linked the 18th century Illuminati to Karl Marx of the mid-19th century, and then to such 19th and 20th century personalities as Russia's Leon Trotsky, Hungary's Béla Kun, Poland and Germany's Rosa Luxemburg, and America's Emma Goldman. As indicated in 1920, the conspiracy involving all of these individuals has been steadily growing. Then in 1953, a California Senate Committee on Education also linked the Illuminati to the scourge of communism. Its conclusions, appearing in what was called the Dilworth Report, stated, so-called modern communism is apparently the same deadly and hypocritical world conspiracy to destroy civilization that was founded by the secret order of the Illuminati in Bavaria on May 1st, 1776, and that raised its hoary head in our colonies at critical periods before the adoption of our federal constitution. In other words, this is saying that this conspiracy had some effect in our own country very shortly after it was founded. Now, why are we dwelling on a history of a plot conceived more than 200 years ago? I've already indicated that, really. It's because something like it, or its actual descendant, threatens our nation, ourselves, and all of mankind today. Now, who was this Adam Weishaupt? A brilliant organizer. If he was anything, that's what he was. The 18th century in which he lived had already suffered from the ravages of numerous secret societies. In 1776, Weishaupt created the most formidable of all of them, calling it the Order of the Illuminati, the Enlightened Ones. It was built on a system of concentric circles of power, influence, and knowledge of the conspiracy's ultimate goal. And this is key. He set out to recruit utopian idealists and ambitious schemers into his sect. From these, he selected the most able and the most cunning and moved them into higher circles. He kept progressing. People kept progressing. The additional circles brought them into greater knowledge and power, knowledge of the order's ultimate long-range plans. His organizational genius enabled him to harness the energies of individuals at every level of his brilliantly conceived structure. The final aim of the Illuminati was to rule the world. In order to accomplish this enormous undertaking, Weishaupt aimed to destroy all existing institutions. His plan called for overthrowing governments, destroying religion, abolishing private property, replacing morality with sensuality and license, and eventually merging all of mankind under one centrally controlled world government. Recruiting for the Illuminati was to be accomplished by first gathering neophytes into the outer circles, where they would be persuaded that the general object of the order was the happiness of mankind. The resulting activity of Weishaupt's neophytes parallels the labor of today's liberals. Both were energized to tear down the basis of a healthy society in the mistaken belief that their efforts would benefit their fellow man. But talented, energetic, and ambitious neophytes were noticed and quickly selected for advancement into the next higher circle, where they were referred to as Minervals. And then soon promising Minervals would be told that religion was mere superstition and patriotism was narrow-mindedness. Then they were introduced to sensual pleasures and corrupted morally, to the degree that abandoning the order became very difficult. If the sensual pleasures weren't lure enough, the thought that their involvement in such practice could be publicized simply froze them in place. Now, the glorification of sensuality and the downgrading of morality had a profound effect on these individuals. Then the next rank was Illuminatus Minor, conferred on those deemed worthy of additional advancement. These elevated recruits were ordered then to spy on others in their respective ranks and to report their findings to a superior. All who did so knew full well that someone was reporting on them. And all the while, any means to achieve the ends of the order were deemed acceptable. And the conspirators spent great energy recruiting into the various levels of their conspiracy the sons of the very powerful and the very wealthy. Not the individual who had made the fortune, but the descendants. And this business of any means to the end is very, very important. You can judge somebody, of course, by what his goals are. But you should also judge him by the means to achieve those goals. No matter how noble a goal may be, foul means can never be justified to get to it. But here we have both foul means and foul ends. Well, the next level of conspiratorial acceptance saw the rank of Illuminatus Major conferred on very highly regarded candidates. And beyond these levels of conspiratorial advancement remain the ranks of Presbyter, Prince, Magus, and Rex. Fewer and fewer conspirators were welcomed into each higher level. As the Illuminatus Rex, the king, Weishaupt was known to only the highest initiates. He actually stated at one point, "My circumstances necessitate that I should remain hidden from most of the members as long as I shall live. I am obliged to do everything through 5 or 6 persons. I have 2 immediately below me into whom I breathe my whole spirit, and each of these 2 has again 2 others, and so on. In this way, I can set 1,000 men in motion and on fire in the simplest manner, and in this way, one must impart orders." I thought it was significant that he said that the individuals immediately below him were the ones into whom I will breathe my whole spirit. Because the derivation of the word conspiracy, the etymological derivation of it, is breathe together. Con meaning together, and spiro meaning I breathe. So the word has obviously had added to it another element, the evil part of it, but breathing together in secret for a foul means is what a conspiracy is. And here's what Weishaupt was saying. And you can see the genius of the organization. Here was a man who could set 1,000 in motion just by talking to 2. Members of the innermost circles were then asked to swear an oath which included the following passage. Just imagine yourselves being asked to swear this kind of an oath. "I bind myself to perpetual silence and unshaken loyalty and submission to the order in the persons of my superiors, here making a faithful and complete surrender of my private judgment, my own will, and every narrow-minded employment of my power and influence." Can you imagine? We've all heard of people in league with the devil. This is certainly very close to that, isn't it? That any man would swear such an order is hard to believe, but believe it we must. Already conversant with other secret societies, Weishaupt formed the Illuminati, as we said, on May 1st of 1776. Now, May 1st is the date that has been selected by communists and socialists the world over to celebrate their respective movements. Most of them believe its significance has something to do with the commemoration of Karl Marx. Hardly any know that May 1st coincides with the founding of Weishaupt's conspiracy in 1776. In 1777, Weishaupt affiliated with a Masonic lodge in order to take control of it for his purposes. By 1782, at the Masonic Congress held at Wilhelmsbad in Germany, Weishaupt's corps of brilliant conspirators succeeded in taking over other French and continental European Grand Orient lodges. Illuminized Masonry spread like wildfire throughout Germany, Sweden, Russia, Poland, Denmark, Hungary, Austria, and France. Poor France. In 1784, a courier for the Illuminati, while traveling in Bavaria, was struck by lightning and killed. When local authorities found the man's body, they also found documents gravely incriminating the order. Further information about the odious deeds and plans of the Illuminati were gleaned in 1786 after a raid on the home of a high-ranking member of the Illuminati named Zwack. And because of what they had learned about the creation of Adam Weishaupt, this Illuminati, the Bavarian authorities decreed that recruiting for the Illuminati would henceforth be prohibited under penalty of death. They felt that strongly about it. So Weishaupt fled north to Gotha, into northern part of Germany, where he ostensibly gave up Illuminism and became reconciled to the Catholic Church, ostensibly. His reconciliation was a ruse, however, and the piety and seeming abandonment of the goals of the order he exhibited only made him far more dangerous. During the 1780s, Illuminists in France began plotting a revolution in that nation in order to destroy existing stability. In 1786, Mirabeau, Danton, Murat, Robespierre, Talleyrand, Lafayette, and others set out to overthrow thrones and altars, the monarchy and the church. And of course, in France, it was the Catholic Church. Such a plan was to be repeated worldwide. Mirabeau organized the Club Breton, which became the Club des Jacobins, the center of Illuminism and Illuminized Freemasonry. and Voltaire, one of the great minds of history who recognized that ideas rule the world and who used his considerable talents for evil goals of the conspiracy, started the Club for Propaganda. It became the conspiracy's mass media of its day for indoctrination of the people in France. When all was ready for the revolution, some pretext was needed to get mobs into the streets of Paris. Word was passed to the people that weapons stored at the Bastille prison could be found and used to protect the monarchy from a rumored insurrection supposedly already underway elsewhere in the city. There was no other insurrection in the city, however. And about 1,000 Parisians marched to the soon-to-be famous prison, many believing that they would find large numbers of skeletons, even prisoners chained in the darkest of dungeons. But what really happened, according to Jean-Paul Marat, one of the conspirators, is very far from the accounts given in most history books. Here is what Marat wrote, and he was one of the conspirators. He said the mob found a mere 7 inmates living quite comfortably. 4 were forgers, 2 were lunatics who had been mad before they were imprisoned, and 1 was a count who had been jailed for monstrous crimes at the request of his family. In the confusion caused by the mob, Marat said, the 4 forgers simply melted into the crowd and disappeared. Who could blame them? Right? The 2 lunatics were found and were placed in a different asylum, and he said, and the count was returned to his disappointed relatives. The mob found no captives in chains, no skeletons, no corpses, and none of the horrors it had been led to expect. But during the attack on the Bastille, the prison guards were butchered, along with some of the brave individuals who tried desperately to stop the rioting. Now, that's only a brief glimpse at what actually transpired during the storming of the Bastille, and yet that event has been memorialized as a great victory of the people who supposedly rose up against their masters in search of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Its date, July 14th, continues to this day as a great national holiday in France. Cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité went throughout France. And of course it means liberty, but there's a difference between liberty and license. And equality is something that you hear even in our own time. And ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that in my understanding, the only place where people are really equal is in prison. And we don't want that. Entire nations have been created into prisons, haven't they? Fraternité is brotherhood. Is it the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, or is it the brotherhood of man under some other spiritual force? Now, whether in French or in any other language, slogans like those can indeed be revolutionary, and they can constitute a very dangerous invitation to evil. The siege of the Bastille inaugurated the monstrous French Revolution, which eventually claimed the lives of King Louis, his queen Marie Antoinette, and 300,000 peasants who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the uprising. The revolutionaries displayed some of their ultimate intentions by seizing Notre Dame Cathedral and placing a prostitute on the high altar where she was worshipped as the goddess of reason. The blood stopped flowing in France only when Napoleon became the nation's dictator. It is sadly true, but perfectly accurate to state that France has never recovered from the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Now, news of the French Revolution, especially at the beginning of it, was greeted by some in America with great joy. It was felt that the uprising in France was a duplication of the strife which led our own nation's people to independence. But a well-informed John Adams received the news of the French Revolution with great misgivings. He believed of France that, quote, adherence to the revolutionary government would lead to great and lasting calamities. Attempts were made by French leaders to enlist the support of President Washington in converting our nation's independence into a copy of France's convulsion, and later to have the United States take the side of France in her war with Spain. But Washington resisted. And when Lafayette, his close ally during the War for Independence, sent the president the key to the Bastille, Washington accepted and hung it in the presidential palace right next to a portrait of Louis XVI. In other words, yes, I will accept your gift, but I will not accept your revolution. Soon the Democratic clubs, patterned after the Jacobin clubs in Paris, sprang up here in America. During this period, in the early 1790s, the government of the United States added a tax on whiskey in order to pay war debts. It led to rebellions. And when authorities went into the central part of Pennsylvania, they found French flags flying over the courthouse in Harrisburg during the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion. President Washington saw the uprising for what it truly was, and he stated, "This is the first formidable fruit of the democratic society's diabolical attempts to destroy the government of this nation." John Jay was our nation's first Chief Justice, and as he assessed the situation, he added, "The Jacobins are still more numerous, more desperate, and more active in this country than is generally supposed. But with excellent leaders, our infant nation survived the onslaught of revolution that gripped France. Nevertheless, partisans for that type of revolution and their designs would reappear again and again." In 1798, two important books about the Illuminati and its destructiveness were published in Europe. The first I already mentioned, John Robeson's Proofs of a Conspiracy. The other book was written by a French priest named the Abbé Baruel, and it's a much more scholarly 4-volume work, just been republished in this format, Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism. The Abbé Baruel was one of 20,000 Catholic clergy, that would be priests, brothers, and nuns, who had to flee France for their lives during the French Revolution, went to England, and were given asylum by the king there, King George III, from whom we separated. Much of the information that we're presenting here comes from these two books, and from others that we will mention as we proceed. And these two individuals, Robeson, the British man, and the Abbé Baruel, the Frenchman, they didn't know each other. They worked independently, and yet they were in absolute agreement about the threat to civilization posed by Weishaupt's Illuminati and about the Illuminati's pivotal role in fomenting and carrying out the French Revolution. Robeson's book was promptly brought to America, and the Reverend G.W. Snyder of Fredericktown, Maryland, sent a copy to George Washington. George Washington had just left the presidency. He was president from 1789 until 1797. We're talking now 1798, 1 year later. And this was a period, of course, when there were Illuminist and Grand Orient lodges of Freemasonry established here in the United States. Most of the Masonry in the United States, the Blue Lodge, the Scottish Rite Freemasonry here, did not come under the influence of the plotters. And after he read Robeson's book, George Washington wrote back to Reverend Snyder in Fredericktown, Maryland, and thanked him in a letter dated October 24th, 1798. His letter said, "Reverend Sir, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am." By the early 1800s, both in Europe and in America, the Illuminati retreated and went more deeply underground. Yale University President Timothy Dwight warned of the Illuminati's presence in 1799. In 1920, a book was written by a man named Professor Vernon Stauffer. He's from Ohio's Hiram College. Supplied many, many details about the Illuminati's threat to America. The book came in 1920, and yet the subject matter of the book is its title, New England and the Bavarian Illuminati. And you can see that this is a well-worn copy given to me recently by a good friend, and I'm very grateful, very glad to have it. Numerous historians insist that the Illuminati, having been exposed and challenged here and in Europe, completely disappeared. But there is very strong evidence that the Italian Carbonari continued to advance the plot based in Italy. Formed around 1810 in the city of Abruzzi, the Carbonari derived its name from the practice of charcoal burning in that city. Meeting in the marketplace, its basic unit became known as the vendita. That's the word whose root gives us, of course, the English word vendor. The highest lodge of the Carbonari was known as the Alta Vendita. I don't think I have to explain that. Alta, the highest, and Vendita, the lodge. In 1818, the Alta Vendita stated this: "Our final aim is that of Voltaire and the French Revolution, the destruction forever of Catholicism and even of the Christian idea, which, if left standing on the ruins of Rome, would be the resuscitation of Christianity later on. The work which we have undertaken is not the work of a day, nor of a month, nor of a year. It may last many years, a century perhaps, but in our ranks the soldier dies and the fight continues." I found that quotation quite useful because I'm trying to demonstrate continuity of conspiracy. In 1827, a young firebrand named Giuseppe Mazzini was welcomed into the Carbonari in Italy. Only 22 years old at the time, he was eventually found himself in a fight with the Carbonari, and he parted with them and rose to an even higher place in the overall conspiracy elsewhere. He formed a group known as Young Italy, which later merged with the Carbonari, and he now had control of the whole thing. In time, other nations had the misfortune of having similar groups formed within their borders. Young Poland, Young Germany, Young France, Young England, Young Ireland, and Young America. Mazzini eventually went to London, where he teamed up with Karl Marx, and then helped to foment a revolution in Italy in 1848, a year when revolution ravaged most of the nations of Europe. And France's Louis Napoleon, eventually achieving power in 1852 as Emperor Napoleon III, was so heavily involved with the Carbonari that he was actually known as Carbonaro. Much was eventually learned about the Carbonari and its Alta Vendita through a book authored by Monsignor George Dillon, a Catholic priest in Scotland. His book was issued in 1885. Actually, what happened is he was giving lectures on the subject, and his lectures were so important and so intense and so well done that he was ordered by church authorities to assemble them into a book. The book was published in 1885. It's called The War of Antichrist with the Church. I have a copy, and I thought I brought a copy of the title page of it, but I guess I didn't. The book supplied important details about Weishaupt's retention of control of the diabolical plot after moving north to Gotha from Bavaria. In 1885, Monsignor Dillon wrote, "Weishaupt, after being deprived of his professorship in Bavaria, found an asylum with the Prince of Coburg-Gotha, where he remained in honor, affluence, and security until his death in 1830. He continued all his life the chief of the Illuminati, and this fact may account in large measure for the fidelity with which the Illuminati of the Revolution invariably carried out his program of perpetual conspiracy for the ends he had in view. It may also account for the strange vitality of the spirit of the Illuminati in Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Spain, and of its continuance to our day." Monsignor Dillon claimed that the Alta Vendita of the Carbonari was, quote, "the immediate successor of the inner circle of Weishaupt," close quote. He further claimed that the first leader of this Italian creation was a corrupt nobleman who took the name Nubius and who died mysteriously in 1837. I believe he was poisoned by Mazzini. Perhaps the most dramatically relevant portion of this important book is its publication of the detailed plans of the Alta Vendita conspirators to send their people into the Catholic Church. By doing so, they expected to gain influence over the Catholic people and to neutralize the Church from within. The permanent instructions of the Alta Vendita to its members contained the following passage. Let the clergy march under your banner in the belief always that they march under the banner of the apostolic keys. Lay your nets like Simon Barjona. Lay them in the depths of the sacristies, the seminaries, and the convents rather than in the depths of the sea. And a leader of the Carbonari, who used the name Piccolo Tiger, added his own instructions to those already given. He wrote, the conspiracy against the Roman See should not confound itself with other projects. It is of absolute necessity to de-Catholicize the world. Let us not conspire except against Rome. We come now to another important element in the conspiracy's continuation, the creation and rise of communism attributed to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx was born in 1818 to a middle-class German family. He went to the University of Bonn, where he distinguished himself by being expelled for drunkenness. He would have been right at home in many American universities, I think. Marx and Engels eventually affiliated with the German branch of the League of the Just, a nice-sounding name for a group that later changed its name to the Communist League. You get an idea of what that was all about immediately. Rooted in secrecy and subversion, the League of the Just, which had established branches in most European nations, set out to unite the continent's various socialist factions under a common manifesto. Its members sought to spread the plague of socialism and communism throughout Europe. Their goals coincide completely with those of the Illuminati, and it is believed by many that the League of the Just was simply another outgrowth of the Illuminati of 1776. The task of writing the unifying document for Europe's socialists fell to Marx and Engels. Unabashed plagiarists, they took the work of another socialist named Blanc and used it as the basis for their own creation, the Communist Manifesto. This is the John Birch Society's edition of the Communist Manifesto. It's complete. It also has a very valuable introduction written by a good friend of mine. The Communist Manifesto is noteworthy for many things, but one of the noteworthy features of it is that the first edition of it in German, this is a German front cover, did not even carry the names of Marx and Engels. Actually, the two were relatively minor players in a much larger and more sinister production. They may have thought that they were at the inner circle. They were far from it. What Marx and Engels gave the world in 1848 amounted to replacing God with reason and religion with the worship of nature. A close study of what Marx produced shows that in addition to being the father of communist-style socialism, he is also a progenitor of extreme environmentalism that makes Earth a god and attacks the very concept of private property. The text of the manifesto boldly states, the theory of the communists can be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property. Now let's make the point here that every communist certainly looks to this, and so does every socialist. In fact, communists and socialists have frequently fought with each other over who owns it. And in a preface written in 1888 on the 40th anniversary of the initial publication of this, Friedrich Engels talked about the fact that when they first wrote it, they wanted to call it the Socialist Manifesto. But they didn't for two reasons. The first is that there were some socialists running around that they felt were quacks and they didn't want to have anything to do with them. And the second reason was that they were more interested in a revolution rather than an evolution. And so they decided to call it the Communist Manifesto and not the Socialist Manifesto. In succeeding pages, this document calls for abolition of the family, ending what it scoffingly refers to as the hallowed correlation of parent and child, replacing homeschooling in favor of state-run education, abolishing the institution of marriage, eradicating countries and nationalities, and terminating all religion and religious-based morality. All of these goals of Marx are being implemented in our nation today. The manifesto then lists its famous 10 planks, all of which are also partially or completely fastened on our nation in the 20th century. Here are the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. To take control of a nation, Marx called for land controls, a graduated income tax, abolition of the rights of inheritance, centralization of credit and banking, and that, of course, is the Federal Reserve, and even supposedly free education in government-run schools. Now, as in other countries, groups advocating socialism and communism and nihilism and other isms were formed here in America. Following the lead of the Illuminati, many sought to tear down the existing order prior to seizing power. In 1886, a remarkable and horrifying incident occurred at the famous Haymarket Square in Chicago. Revolutionaries had made a practice of congregating in the square to recruit and to preach their poison to the crowds. The authorities knew that some of these characters were dangerous, and so there were always plenty of police on hand. On a particular day in 1886, revolutionaries took stations at the outer fringes of the crowd, and on a given signal, many of them pulled out weapons that they had hidden, fired them at the police, and hurled hidden bombs at police wherever they could find them. 7 policemen were killed and 68 were injured, some so seriously they were never able to work again. Captain Michael Shack of the Chicago Police investigated the incident and spent 3 years learning what had really transpired. In 1889, his monumental book, Anarchy and Anarchists, concluded that the incident was a step in a carefully orchestrated worldwide plan. He wrote in 1889, "In London, there are all the factors for the most dangerous mob the world can produce. In France, the Commune is stronger than ever it was, and the Red Terror may appear with every turn of the whirligig of politics. In Spain and Italy, the socialists are busy, while in Germany and Russia, a crisis is at hand. Let none mistake either the purpose or the devotion of these fanatics, nor their growing strength. This is a methodic, not a haphazard conspiracy. The ferment in Russia is controlled by the same heads and the same hands as the activity in Chicago. There is a cold-blooded, calculating purpose behind this activity, manipulating every part of it the world over to a common and ruinous end." That's in Chicago in 1889. Additional evidence about the continuity of this conspiratorial design from Weishaupt to today appeared in 1980. The publication of a large, thick book called Fire in the Minds of Men. The author, James H. Billington, a well-connected scholar who taught at both Harvard and Princeton and eventually rose to become the librarian of the United States Congress. He is there today. His book is subtitled Origins of the Revolutionary Faith, and it traces revolutionary activity from the 18th to the 20th century. Billington discussed the importance to conspiratorial continuity of Filippo Buonarroti, who left Italy for France in 1792, brought his knowledge of Illuminism to Switzerland, and eventually collaborated with Mazzini in forming Young Italy. Buonarroti's goal, according to Billington, was the creation by force of a new secular order. His organizational plan, said Billington, was simply lifted from the Bavarian order of Illuminists. And Billington also stated that it is from the Bavarian Illuminism that modern revolutionary tradition has arisen. Now, he also made note of something that a lot of Americans have wondered about. He showed that the contrast between the New American Federation and the occult symbology on its Great Seal. Now, you've all seen the occult symbology on the Great Seal. It's on the back of the dollar bill. I have a large replica of a dollar bill here. If you have one in your pocket, you might want to take out it now and look at it. We'll discuss it for a few minutes. This is the Great Seal of the United States. The eagle, which is to the right on the dollar bill, is the front side of it. The back side of it is the pyramid with the eye, and the slogan at the bottom, Novus Ordo Seclorum. If you look closely, you see Roman numbers at the bottom of the pyramid, and they add up to 1776. And there would be people, of course, who would say that means July 4th, 1776. I'm not so sure of that. I think it's May 1st, 1776. Now, the slogan at the bottom there, Novus Ordo Seclorum, translates literally New Order of the Ages. It translates freely New World Order. I think you've heard that. The all-seeing eye was the symbol of the Illuminati. There's no doubt about that. The pyramid is the symbol of the same symbol as I've been using here. I've been talking about concentric circles of power and influence leading up to the top. But you can make that same point with a pyramid, can't you? It's wide at the bottom, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you get towards the top, and then you have the pinnacle of it. The Great Seal was put together in 1782, 6 years after the foundation of the United States of America. Revolutionary thinking surely played a role in putting an occult mark on our nation only 6 years after it was formed. Generally, the reverse of the seal had been little known, and because of its occult significance, wherever it was known, it was ill-regarded. People would jump away from it, don't want to have anything to do with that. But then in 1935, Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace persuaded Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau to place the Great Seal on the back of the $1 bill. According to Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Wallace informed Morgenthau that Novus Ordo Seclorum meant New Deal. Obviously, Morgenthau didn't know any Latin. Schlesinger also stated that for many years, Morgenthau had to defend himself from charges that he was mixed up with the occult and the secret societies. Now, it's also interesting to note that Henry Wallace was as close to being a communist and never named a communist as anybody who's ever lived in this country. Henry Wallace was heavy into all kinds of communist activity. It was through his leadership of the Agriculture Department that many, many communists were brought into government, including a man named Alger Hiss, who started in the Agriculture Department. Now, we've talked about conspiracy. Well, what are the effects of these conspiracies? Well, let's go back and think about it here. 300,000 peasants died in revolutionary France. That's a sizable portion of the population at the time. There have been murder and mayhem and revolution throughout the 19th century in Europe. You get into the 20th century and you see the Soviet Union murdering 12 million in the Ukraine with an enforced famine. They actually loaded all the food on flat cars and box cars and shipped it out of the Ukraine, and 12 million people died. Government estimates, U.S. government estimates, are that the Chinese communists killed somewhere in excess of 35 million of their own people since the end of World War II. You go to Cambodia in the 1930s and you see 2 million out of 7 million slain when the communists took control of that country at the end of the Vietnam War. You go over to Afghanistan and you see that 1.4 million civilians were murdered by the Soviets who invaded that peaceful neighbor in 1979, and all during the 1980s created mayhem, even to dropping booby-trapped toys from aircraft that young children would pick up and have their eyes blown out and their limbs torn away. Why all the murder? Why all the horror? Don't they want colonies of slaves? They want world government, and yes, they want colonies of slaves, but it has long been a tactic of the conspiracy to control populations through the use of terror. This is why they murder, and especially why they murder indiscriminately. Terror keeps people in line. Terror not only helps to conquer, it is a very effective way of keeping a people conquered. And I know many, many Americans who say it would never affect me, and yet if you ask them to go to a meeting of the John Birch Society, they say, well, who might be there? Who might see me? Who might somebody take down license plate numbers? We still live in a free country, my friends. Obviously, you all believe that. It's easy for Americans to conclude that nothing similar to what we've described here could happen in America, and especially here today. But the most recent perpetrators of these horrible crimes are still around, aren't they? And some of them, like Mikhail Gorbachev, are now treated as noble humanitarians.
Yeah.
Gorbachev led the Soviet Union during the rape of Afghanistan. Far from being repudiated, our own leaders have embraced arch criminals in Russia, in China, in the United States, and in various international forums where world government is praised. Right now, today, we have the Vice President of the United States fawning before the worst murderers in all history in Beijing. Crime unpunished is crime rewarded. The punishment should be at least the bare minimum of ostracism. That our leaders would sit across tables and participate in banquets and conferences with individuals known to have the blood of millions on their hands is testimony to their own willingness to submit to a conspiracy's dictates. More than 200 years ago, Adam Weishaupt gathered the worst evildoers of his day into his conspiratorial web. But he also recognized the need to influence the masses, to confuse them, and to disarm them. Reverend Clarence Kelly pointed out in his 1974 book called Conspiracy Against God and Man, pointed out that the Illuminati's goal included the following. We must win the common people in every corner. This will be obtained chiefly by means of the schools. We must acquire the direction of education, of church management, of the professorial chair, and of the pulpit. And though not their only targets, the schools and the churches were to be the prime targets of the conspiracy. Both still are. In the conspiracy's view, secrecy has always been essential. In Proofs of a Conspiracy, John Robeson quoted many of the instructions given to the rising Illuminati members. One of those instructions said this: "The great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but always covered by another name and another occupation." In 1968, a man wrote a piece about this conspiracy, and he made, I think, a rather brilliant short statement at the beginning of it. He said, "The first job of a conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist." And today, great energy is spent to disparage the very notion of conspiracy and to hold up for ridicule anyone who dares to suggest that deliberate plotting is at the root of our nation's problems. And yet the evidence to bring one to conclude that a conspiracy does exist is available. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. I always remember James Fallerstall's famous remark. He didn't use the word conspiracy, but he certainly implied it. He said, if they were all mistakes, they would have made a few in our favor. Consistency is not a characteristic of haphazardness and stupidity. We have to ask a question of our fellow Americans, and the question is very simple. Which way, America? Is it going to be the way of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world? Or is it going to be a new world order created by a criminal conspiracy bent on making slaves of the human race? The choice is not just mine. It's yours as well. Robert Welsh founded the John Birch Society in 1958. He warned about the power and influence of a worldwide master conspiracy at every opportunity. In September 1972, and that would be just about 25 years ago, wouldn't it? His warning included this short statement. The plan is to establish very soon the first stages of a new world order. This will be the novus ordo seclorum for which a self-perpetuating inner circle of conspirators has been working and scheming relentlessly during some 6 generations. Now, obviously, Robert Welsh equated the phrase New World Order and novus ordo seclorum with the designs of the conspiracy, didn't he? And George Bush started using the phrase in 1990 and said he dreamed it up on a speedboat ride off Kennebunk, Maine. On September 11th of 1990, George Bush said, out of these troubled times, this was the beginning of the war in Iraq, out of these troubled times, our 5th objective, a new world order, can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders. Now, there's tremendous amount of information in that statement. First of all, New World Order. Secondly, United Nations, world government, the goal of the conspiracy. Thirdly, he wants that world government as envisioned by its founders. Who were its founders? The U.S. delegation was led by a secret communist named Alger Hiss. There were 15 others in that delegation who were later named by congressional investigating bodies as members of the U.S. Communist Party. There were also 43 members of that delegation who were members of the World Government Promoting Council on Foreign Relations. And that's the U.S. delegation. Soviets had a delegation led by a hardcore communist named Andrei Gromyko. Other nations sent their one-worlders, their socialists, their communists, and their utopian dreamers. Advocates of national sovereignty were not welcome. And the goals of these founders of the United Nations was clear. They wanted world government. They wanted the New World Order. They didn't use the phrase at the founding of the UN, but they certainly could have. The New World Order was to be built around 2 main pillars: world government and economic control through some form of socialism, as outlined by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. It could be either communist-imposed socialism, or it could be socialism brought about by the slower and more scheming technique of having a people vote themselves into tyranny, as we are doing in the United States of America. Once imposed worldwide, however, economic control would be maintained by communist-style force. The conspiracy also fomented wars because they knew that war always leads to 2 main goals, and those goals are more government and moral decline. In 1953 and 54, a congressman from Tennessee named Carroll Reese led a special House committee formed to investigate the large tax-exempt foundations that had been financing subversion within our nation. He hired a man named Norman Dodd to be the committee's top researcher, and Dodd sent a committee staffer named Catherine Casey to examine the records of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The results of the Reese Committee's investigations are recounted in several books that we distribute. Miss Casey was a lawyer. She spent several days in New York at the Carnegie Endowment, and she returned to Washington in a somewhat dazed condition. She reported that the Carnegie minutes for 1911 told of its trustees raising a question. The question is there any means known to man more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? At the end of a year of discussing this, according to the minutes, the trustees concluded that there was no more effective way to accomplish that goal other than war. So then they raised another question. How do we involve the United States in a war? When this discussion was being held by the Carnegie trustees, the United States had completely severed all but diplomatic ties to Europe. Our country had become a totally independent and rapidly growing nation of religiously based people who wanted most of all to be left alone to work out their own destiny. Unbeknownst to them, powerful individuals were busily plotting to alter their entire life by pushing the nation into a war that would indeed produce moral decline, more government, and the beginning of a drive towards world government. Our nation did go to war in 1917, and out of World War I came the first attempt at world government, the League of Nations. In 1919, when the U.S. Senate refused to have our nation become a part of the League of Nations, its advocates formed the Council on Foreign Relations for the purpose of making sure that a future try at world government would be approved. Then they went to work to gather into the CFR's ranks the movers and shakers of our nation who would then promote world government. Now let's stop for a minute here and consider the fact that the President of the United States today is a member of this Council on Foreign Relations. And so are 6 of the last 7 presidents. Just about every cabinet official in the Clinton administration is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The leaders of the U.S. Congress, Gingrich, the Republican leader in the House, Gephardt, the Democrat leader in the House, are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So are quite a few other congressmen. And a whole bunch of senators, including Senator Kerry here from Massachusetts, 2 senators from Maine, 2 senators from Rhode Island, Senator Moynihan from New York, and some others. You will also find in the Council on Foreign Relations 3 of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. Now, the executive branch is dominated by these people. The legislative branch is fairly well dominated by these people, and the judicial branch at the Supreme Court level is certainly partially dominated by these people. James Madison is the father of the Constitution, the 4th president of our nation, a man to whom we owe a great deal. And he at one point said, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in any single one place is the very definition of tyranny. We're very close to it. We're very close to it. Reese Committee staffer Catherine Casey also reported finding in the Carnegie minutes that the trustees exulted over the entry of our nation into World War I. She discovered that the trustees even sent a telegram to President Wilson cautioning him to see that the war did not end too soon. In keeping with the Illuminati's modus operandi, no scruple, not even the deaths of many, many thousands in a world war, was to interfere with the designs of the conspiracy. Throughout its history, the conspiracy has worked to foment wars, and U.S. involvement in that war resulted in part from anger over Germany's sinking of the British vessel, the Lusitania, which was loaded with munitions. The people aboard it were not aware of that. The German government had tried to warn people not to travel on the Lusitania because it was an armed auxiliary cruiser of the British Navy, and they knew it. And one torpedo hit the ship, and it hit the area where the munitions were, and the Lusitania sank not because of the torpedo, but because of an internal explosion. All of that has been detailed in a book written by a British author named Colin Simpson. World War II for our nation began when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And yet the evidence that President Roosevelt and his top advisors knew that the Japanese plans included attacking Hawaii are overwhelming. The top leaders of our government refused even to alert our own forces. World government advocates, still angry over our nation's refusal to join the League of Nations, wanted another, even more horrible war in order to generate support for another try at world government, the United Nations. And where the Carnegie trustees in 1918 had urged President Wilson not to end the war too soon, President Roosevelt extended World War II by refusing to accept a Japanese peace proposal in January of 1945. World War II ended in Europe in May of 45. It ended in the Pacific against Japan in August of 45. 7 months prior to the war ending against Japan, a detailed 40-page peace offer was given to General Douglas MacArthur and sent immediately on to President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt ignored it, said MacArthur is one of our best generals but one of our worst politicians, and went off to Yalta and sold out Eastern Europe and China. The peace proposal, forwarded by MacArthur in January of 1945, contained all of the conditions that Japan was later able to surrender under 7 months later. Here's an article from the front page of the Chicago Tribune. August 19th, 1945. It was published simultaneously in the Washington Times Herald the very same day. Written by a famous American journalist of his day named Walter Troway. The headline says, "Bear peace bid U.S. rebuffed 7 months ago." And it goes and details the fact that all of the conditions that the Japanese were later permitted to surrender under were contained in the peace offer in January of 1945. Now, if the Japanese had been able to surrender in January of 1945, there would have been no Iwo Jima, where 28,000 Americans died, or either died or were wounded, and 21,000 Japanese. There would have been no Okinawa, where the casualties were even higher. There would have been no firebombing of Japanese cities by American warplanes, which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands. And there would have been no atomic bombs dropped on Japan. There would also have been no entry of the Soviet Union into World War II at the 11th hour, or at the 11th hour and 50 minute. Soviet Union entered the war about 5 days before it ended. And because they were our great allies, they were given occupation rights over Manchuria, where the Japanese had stored vast quantities of arms, which were immediately turned over to Mao Zedong and led to Mao Zedong taking control of China. The perfidy involved in all of this is hard to imagine, and yet there it is. Had that Japanese peace offer been accepted when first given, there would have been much less death, much less destruction, no atomic bomb, which has spurred many, many people to believe that a world government is the only recourse. In addition to creating wars, the overall plan of the Illuminati and all its successor organizations was to infiltrate and control key areas of human conduct. These would include education, religion, the informing of the people through the mass media, and the government. We'll focus for just a few minutes on each of these areas, beginning with the conspiracy's efforts in the field of education. When Catherine Casey of the Reese Committee pored over the minutes of the Carnegie trustees, she read of their plans to take control of American education to assure that the nation did not revert to the kind of life it had been enjoying prior to World War I. The Carnegie trustees approached counterparts at other foundations and received their agreement to spend some of their enormous resources to steer the nation's educational system down a globalist and socialist path. Counterparts at the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to work for control of that portion of American education dealing with domestic subjects. The Carnegie trustees then approached prominent historians seeking their willingness to alter the teaching of American history. When they met with some refusals by historians, they secured the help of the Guggenheim Foundation to grant scholarships to selected candidates for advanced degrees in history who would carry out their designs. And hardly any Americans had any appreciation at all of what was going on here. The overall purpose of this activity was to alter the self-reliance and the independent spirit of the people of this nation so that their resistance to a world government could be broken. In his important 1981 book called Is Public Education Necessary?, Samuel L. Blumenfeld pointed out that government-run education in America was never needed, that the literacy rate in our nation was greater before the advent of public schools and compulsory education, that socialists and others promoted the public school movement through secret organizations as far back as 1829, and that the basis upon which American education was built and flourished, strong emphasis on religion and morality, has effectively been cast aside. Blumenfeld reported that there were several church groups right here in Massachusetts in the early 19th century working for the creation of state-run education that they wanted to control. People who want to force their religion on others are fakers, phonies, and dangerous. The leaders of these religions hope to use the government system to propagate their beliefs by force. Later on, a socialist named Robert Dale Owen formed a secret society working for the same compulsory government system that would spread his beliefs. They found a common hero in a man named Horace Mann, who we are told today should be revered as the father of American public education. If anything, Blumenfeld says he's the father of centralized, state-controlled public education governed by a state bureaucracy and financed by taxes on property. The key element in all of this, and again, this is 170 years ago, was a desire on the part of several groups to use the force of government to propagate their views. Some religious in nature, others political goals, but they all wanted force. So they had to have a government-run school system first. Blumenfeld noted that Horace Mann happily accepted the support of anyone in changing American education from its free market course to an irreversible statist one. And Blumenfeld noted that these people selected for the model of their authoritarian system the Prussian system, which actually was a descendant of the Illuminati. In 1830s, a Unitarian minister right here in Boston named Orestes Brownson had become one of the leaders of the movement to establish compulsory state-run education in Massachusetts. He later converted to Catholicism, abandoned his drive for compulsory education, and he ended up teaching at Notre Dame University in Indiana. In his own autobiography, Brownson wrote of the goal that he initially sought, and he said, the great object was to get rid of Christianity. For this purpose, a secret society was formed, and the whole country was to be organized on the plan of the Carbonari of Italy. Again, we see the continuity. When his book was written, 1981, Blumenfeld summarized the American educational scene. While it certainly is true that there are some good teachers in some public schools who are able to help some students in spite of the system, Blumenfeld wrote, today most of the young adults who emerge from the process read poorly, write miserably, have stunted vocabularies, cannot do arithmetic well, know little geography and less history, and know virtually nothing about the economic system in which they live. In many schools, they fall under strong peer pressure, are introduced to drugs and sexual promiscuity, while their teachers preach the moral relativism of secular humanism as a substitute for the outmoded moral codes of religion. This same man, Blumenfeld, also wrote a book about the National Education Association. He said of it that it is uncompromisingly atheistic. It has advocated amoral sex education, abortion on demand, gun control, environmental extremism, nuclear disarmament, acceptance of the homosexual lifestyle, and socialized medicine. That's what it's for. What is it against? It's against encouraging students to restrict sexual intercourse to heterosexual marriage, wants no one to be permitted to homeschool his children unless properly licensed and forced to follow a state-approved curriculum, and it objects to testing teachers for drugs, alcohol, or AIDS. In 30 states, public school teachers are required to become members of the state affiliate of the National Education Association, Massachusetts being one of them, effectively amounting to membership in the NEA itself. No American should be required to belong to any union in order to work, and no one should be forced by law to pay for an educational system, good or bad. If the American people were given a choice to continue to put the tremendous amounts of money that they're putting into the public school system, the government school system today, how many of them do you think would continue to do it? And if they weren't required to put their money there, what would they do with the money? Wouldn't there be a proliferation of private schools and academies? And every time I say that, there's somebody who says, well, what about the poor people who couldn't afford it? Ladies and gentlemen, our history in this nation is one of great charity. Especially churches would be very anxious to have young people attend their church schools. Scholarships would be all over the place. I always think of a man right here in the western part of Massachusetts who came from a very poor family, and yet he was very bright, and he was very eager to go to school, and the people in the community arranged to send him off to an academy and then send him off to the university. And he came out a communist. His name was W.E.B. Du Bois. Let's shift to religion. In 1937, there was a religious publication called Religion in Life, and it carried articles by a soon-to-be famous American who was an official of the Federal Council of Churches. I'm not going to tell you the man's name until after I tell you what he wrote. All right? So you try to guess. In 1937, this man wrote, "A theoretical solution lies in the abolition of the entire concept of national sovereignty and the unification of the world into a single nation." Does that sound like what we're talking about here? He also said, fascism changing almost overnight the characteristics of entire peoples. The spectacle of communism and fascism changing almost overnight the characteristics of entire people. Millions of individuals have been made into different and, on the whole, finer people by communism and fascism. Who is this man who called for the abolition of national sovereignty? Who praised communism and fascism? His name is John Foster Dulles, founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of several of the commissions organized by the Federal Council of Churches, a member of the U.S. delegation to the San Francisco Conference where the United Nations was created, and our nation's Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration. A prominent churchman and even more prominent diplomat, Dulles spent his entire life seeking to undo the United States of America. The Federal Council of Churches, with which he was so heavily affiliated, was preaching the smell of totalitarianism so loudly and so widely that it could no longer be denied. And so in 1950, the Federal Council of Churches leaders met at a meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, and they simply changed the name of the organization to the National Council of Churches. And they said in their own publication that all of the work of the Federal Council will continue under the new auspices. The National Council of Churches hasn't changed. In the early 1960s, during Vatican Council II, a mere 450 of the Council's 2,150 bishops petitioned to have the entire Council reissue a condemnation of communism. That's only 1 out of 5. This small number, despite the clear record of the preceding 20 years when communist-led governments had killed, tortured, and jailed thousands of Catholic priests in Europe and China, as well as killing far more ordinary civilian people. And the killing and the jailing was still going on. This is 1962. Even worse, it was later learned that other church leaders had secretly arranged to cancel the church's once hardline attitude toward communism. Opponents of communism within the church didn't know that some of their own officials had worked out a deal with the Kremlin in 1962. The deal said, if you will send your KGB-designated Russian Orthodox clerics to the council will no longer condemn communism. So the communists won on both ends of that deal. In the United States in early 1983, Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago and Father J. Brian Hare, a priest from Boston who was an official of the U.S. Catholic Conference in Washington, they met in the nation's capital with selected members of the Council on Foreign Relations. At that meeting, the two Catholic clergymen thanked the CFR members for the assistance that they had gotten from them in formulating a position for the church on the matter of nuclear deterrence. The position they formulated is a thinly disguised form of pacifism, which is both un-American and un-Catholic. Father Hare had been a student at Harvard University of Professors Henry Kissinger and Stanley Hoffman, both veteran members of the Council on Foreign Relations. He would become himself a member of the CFR in 1975, and a few years after he brought Cardinal Bernardine into their ranks, Cardinal Bernardine himself was welcomed into membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. Another nationally known Catholic clergyman is Father Theodore Hesburgh of Notre Dame. Father Hesburgh has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations since 1972. He has served on its board of directors and as the chairman of its membership committee. Not a minor player. He has also served as chairman of the abortion funding Rockefeller Foundation and is a member of the board of the stridently secular and anti-religious People for the American Way organization. He has characterized pro-life advocates as mindless and crude zealots. In 1973, Father Hesburgh condemned national sovereignty as the one great remaining divider of humankind. As this newspaper headline shows, Notre Dame's president proposes world citizenship. He had no use for national sovereignty. In 1991, he stated that a real new world order must include a commitment of 25,000 troops from each of 20 countries to be available for use by the United Nations Security Council. These troops, said Hesburgh, would be employed as enforcers of peace wherever world problems developed. He wanted a UN peace force. Now, if you know what an oxymoron is, I've just given you. As horrifying as all of these views of one of America's most prominent Catholic clergymen really are, it's even more horrifying to realize that no one in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church has spoken out to oppose his subversive stance. No one. No one has to be a Catholic today to know that over the past 30 years, the Church has undergone a wholesale revision of its attitudes, its liturgy, and its disciplines. All throughout Latin America, and even into the southwestern United States, a new interpretation of Scripture based on Marxism and labeled liberation theology has been introduced by revolutionaries within the Catholic clergy. The consequences, both politically and religiously, have been devastating. The Catholic Church, always known by friend or foe as a bastion of traditional values, has become fragmented and disoriented. It didn't happen by chance, ladies and gentlemen. Into the vacuum created by religions that have lost their way has come New Age mysticism and pantheism. These new trends have found a very welcome home in the United Nations. For many years, a man named Robert Mueller served as an Assistant Secretary General at the UN. He's one of many working zealously to create a UN-directed New World religion. And Mueller is not alone. Much of the proceedings at the UN Conference on Environment and Development held in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro centered around the need for a new universal faith based on the worship of nature, even of the earth itself. Among the enthusiastic supporters of this new UN-style religion can be found current UN official Maurice Strong, Vice President Al Gore, and former Soviet dictator Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1995, plans for the formal establishment of a new organization called United Religions were laid at a meeting in San Francisco. The gathering was held in 1995 in San Francisco in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations in that city. Representatives of virtually all religions were present, along with some of the world's political and spiritual luminaries. Britain's Princess Margaret was there. South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, doesn't he get around? Lech Walesa of Poland was there. UN Secretary General at the time, Boutros Ghali, was there. Plans were announced at that gathering to create a charter for the new United Religions organization by June of 1997. It's to be patterned after the UN. It's going to have a General Assembly, a Security Council, and a Secretary General. It's going to have everything that the UN has, including no God. Headquarters for the group are to be established by the year 2000 at the Presidio, a former U.S. military installation in San Francisco. Prime mover in this interfaith religiosity is a bishop named William Swing of the Episcopal Diocese of California. His partners in the effort include the Gorbachev Foundation, which is also located at the Presidio in San Francisco, and then another New York-based organization called the World Conference on Religion and Peace. Weishaupt sought to gain control of the schools and the churches to influence the common people. His goal has not been fully realized, but progress toward it has indeed been frightening. If he were alive today, he would seek control of the mass media in order to spread the conspiracy's influence. And though he himself is long in his grave, his conspiratorial descendants have certainly not overlooked the mass media. You cannot discuss the mass media and its impact on the American people today without discussing the Council on Foreign Relations. Most Americans know little or nothing about that organization, but this special issue of our New American magazine contains numerous charts. You can see them here. And it lists the CFR members, only 3,300 of them, and where they are placed, where they have gained influence. And one of the key areas of their influence is in the media. And there's a page and a half, or almost 2 full pages, of prominent media personalities who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They sit atop ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, and PBS. They can be found in leadership positions at the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, National Review, Fortune, Forbes, and others. And ladies and gentlemen, that covers many of the bases, doesn't it? In addition, there are syndicated columnists from the CFR whose work appears in other newspapers. Now, there's no doubt that communism has always been an arm of the conspiracy we've been describing. When anyone in America tried to sound an alarm about communist penetration of government, however, it was he who became controversial. Such was the tactic of the Illuminati, whose response to anyone who might expose its members or its goals was, again according to Professor Robeson, to decry him. The treatment accorded Senator Joseph McCarthy supplies great evidence of the conspiracy's ability to decry its adversaries. Now you might say to yourself, you're taking on a big one here in trying to defend Joseph McCarthy. Well, let's do so. Contrary to widespread belief, McCarthy never harmed the good name of any innocent person. The truth about the Wisconsin senator is that he publicly named less than 200 individuals as security risks. All of those he named were indeed connected to communism. His efforts, however, produced no deaths, no injuries, no tortures, no arrests without warrant, no imprisonment without trial, no deportations, no denials of due process. The crisis for Joe McCarthy came when he shifted his investigation from the Communist Party to the high officials of government who were working to protect party members and who were working to impede his legitimate work as a United States Senator. If you go back to what I said at the beginning here, we have a conspiracy of concentric circles of power and influence. One of the far from the core rings is the Communist Party. Above that are people who protect the Communist Party, finance the Communist Party, dignify it, see to it that nobody interrupts what it's doing. When McCarthy shifted his focus from the Communist Party ring to the next ring, he had to be destroyed. In 1954, McCarthy learned that a high-level meeting to formulate plans to deal with McCarthy had been held in the office of Attorney General Herbert Brownell. Attendees at the meeting included top presidential advisor Sherman Adams, Ambassador to the UN Henry Cabot Lodge, Army Secretary John Adams, and, according to the New York Times, top White House defense and justice officials. McCarthy had subpoena powers. He sought to find out details of the meeting. He said, "Come on down here and tell us all about it under oath." But his orders and his requests, his efforts were blocked by an order from President Eisenhower forbidding the executive branch employees to supply information about the Get McCarthy meeting. This is the front page of the New York Times the day after Eisenhower's order. There are two main headlines. The first is about the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The second one that I've highlighted says, "McCarthy hearing off a week as Eisenhower bars report." And this is Tuesday, May 18, 1954. It says over here, "Senator is irate. President orders aides not to disclose details of top-level meeting." From that day forward, all congressional investigations of the executive branch were stymied. The Eisenhower order gave rise to the stonewalling practice known as executive privilege. The order effectively destroyed one of the carefully crafted checks and balances provided in the Constitution of the United States. We've all heard that phrase, haven't we? Checks and balances. The legislative branch is supposed to check the executive. The judicial branch is supposed to check the both of them. Round robin checking to make sure nobody exceeded the powers given to each of the branches in the Constitution. And ladies and gentlemen, forget it. It doesn't exist. All power is gravitating to the executive branch. That Congress allowed the order of Eisenhower to stand in 1954 and continues to allow it today is evidence of the conspiracy's power. The senators who disapproved of McCarthy's campaign against communists infiltrating our government then went after McCarthy. Now keep in mind that McCarthy wasn't saying you couldn't be a communist. He was saying if you were a communist, you had no right to work in a sensitive position in the government of the United States. And that makes a lot of sense. McCarthy was eventually condemned on two completely ludicrous charges. The first was for not appearing before a Senate subcommittee after being invited to do so. Never had anyone been disciplined for failing to accept a mere invitation. But even more incredibly, the invitation never reached McCarthy until several days after the date of the suggested appearance. He was on a hunting trip in a remote part of northern Wisconsin, and the issuing senators knew it. And for that, they condemned him. The other charge claimed that McCarthy had impaired the dignity of the Senate by describing the proceedings against him as a lynch party, which it certainly was. And ladies and gentlemen, those are the reasons why Joseph McCarthy was condemned by the United States Senate. He wasn't censured, by the way. Censure would have been a higher disciplinary move than a condemnation, which is a semantic thing, really, but it wasn't as deep as a censure. But how many Americans know that? Aren't most Americans told that Joseph McCarthy was a man who went around damaging the reputations of countless thousands of innocent people? That Joseph McCarthy inspired terror throughout government? That Joseph McCarthy impaired the work of government? His name has even ended up in the dictionary as an adjective. McCarthyism. Well, that's a noun, but you can be a McCarthyite. That's in the dictionary too. McCarthy's reputation was destroyed. His name became a symbol of unfair practices he never employed. Investigations bearing on subversives within government were halted, and most of the communists and communist sympathizers whom he sought to remove or who fled either never left or were welcomed back into government service. The real reason why McCarthy had to be stopped was that he was getting too close to revealing the secret power above communism. In all, 67 senators voted to condemn McCarthy on those two trumped-up charges, and only 22 stood by him in 1954. And those totals provide striking testimony of the power of the communist movement in America and of the conspiracy guiding it and protecting it. It's worth taking a minute here to discuss the role in this entire thing by a young senator from Massachusetts at the time named John Kennedy. John Kennedy was only in the Senate for 2 years at this point. John Kennedy suffered from back problem. He said it was because of war injuries, probably was. He was not in the Senate during the day of the vote. And so he did not register for or against McCarthy. And he was put into a difficult position, and it was fortunate for him that he was in the hospital. Because Joseph McCarthy had been very, very close to the Kennedy family. He frequented the Hyannisport compound, played touch football on the lawn, dated the sisters of John Kennedy, and is even godfather to one of Bobby Kennedy's children. He was that close to the family. Now, John Kennedy made a move for Vice President of the United States in 1956, and I'm dating myself here now to remind you of this. He lost out to Estes Kefauver, who ran with Adlai Stevenson and was defeated for the second time by Eisenhower in '56. But after that, the Kennedy boys and some of their friends decided they weren't going to try to be vice president next time. They were going to go for the whole ball of wax. And so they started John Kennedy going around the country speaking at Democratic affairs and endearing himself to Democratic politicians. The grande dame of the Democratic Party during this period was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt had amassed a total of 100 Communist Front organizations that she herself had joined. Cited Communist Front organizations, cited by official agencies of the U.S. government. Had a Democratic Party probably around late 57, I believe it was. John Kennedy was the featured speaker, and Eleanor Roosevelt was chosen to introduce him. And before she did, she looked down the dais at him and she said, "Jack, you know, there's a question I've always wanted to ask you. I know that you weren't in the Senate the day that McCarthy vote was held. Now, if you were in the hospital, and I'm aware of that. If you had been in the Senate on that day, you would have voted against McCarthy, wouldn't you?" And he said yes. And he was permitted to be the nominee of the Democrat Party, and he was permitted to be the President of the United States. It was a very key test he had to pass. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how it works. Now, in America today, we see a still free people voluntarily building their own iron curtain around themselves. Many are gripped by fear of retribution and fail to speak out and oppose what is being done to our country and ourselves. Don't let anyone ever do that to you. You're an American. Your nation is being made over into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that have come before. You've got to help us to stop this treachery. How can the conspiracy's progress be stopped? The solution is majestically simple. In fact, the essence of any brilliant strategy is simplicity. The conspiracy's drive toward totalitarian power can be stopped if enough people know about it, speak out about it, and demand a return to age-old principles. The power of a dedicated few is something that most people have no appreciation of. Let me give you a few quick examples of what can be done by a few. 25 years ago, a group of criminals who happened to be American Indians cooked up a plan to take control of a section of land within our borders, out in the Dakotas, declare themselves an independent nation, import arms from communist governments with whom they were already in contact, get recognition from communist nations, maybe even United Nations, and wage war on the United States from within. These subversives had already intimidated large numbers of fellow Indians and had been financed by the U.S. government. Virtually overnight, they boasted that they spoke for all of the American Indian population. But in a matter of just a few weeks, wide distribution of just 2 pamphlets produced by the John Birch Society sufficiently exposed the plot, and the American Indian movement was repudiated. A few years later, the Equal Rights Amendment was sailing toward complete ratification when the John Birch Society recognized it for what it truly was. As written, The Equal Rights Amendment would have given the federal government new authority to control any activity engaged in by men or women. That's everything. Our people went to work and persuaded state legislators to reject the ratification, and that threat of dramatically enlarged federal power passed. More recently, plans to subject the Constitution of our nation to wholesale change through a constitutional convention or a conference of the states were thwarted when our people distributed the truth about the intent to do that, and state legislators have said no. Small groups of people can succeed if they're organized. Nobody knew that better than Weishaupt and the Illuminati. Why not organization for good? Not a conspiracy. A wide open activity. Wake the town. Tell the people. If we look around us, we have to admit that some hidden force has a tight grip on our government, on the press, on religion, on education, even the military. How many of you know that the U.S. government has just leased bases at the former Long Beach Naval Station in California to a group called COSCO, C-O-S-C-O, China Overseas Shipping Company, an agency of the Communist Chinese government? That COSCO company had a ship about 2 years ago called something Phoenix. The ship was apprehended by customs agents who found several thousand AK-47 rifles destined for distribution among street gangs in Los Angeles. And those are the people who we have just leased naval port facilities in Long Beach, California. While Al Gore is over bowing and scraping before the bloodiest murderers in all history. Taxes and controls continue to grow. Our children can't offer a prayer in the increasingly deficient and dangerous schools we are forced to finance. Many of the churches we were brought up in are unrecognizable today. The mass media we are told to trust give us pap and misinformation for news and a steady diet of smut and terror for entertainment. We are told that doing business with the worst murderers in all history, the Chinese communists, is a good idea, even while they continue to murder and tyrannize their own people. We are told that a still professing socialist named Gorbachev is some kind of a new Democrat. And we wonder as he is invited to speak in the halls of America. We are told that our armed forces must police the world for the United Nations. We remember that those who warned about tolerating abortion also warned that allowing it would lead to the killing of the old and the infirm. Will the politically incorrect be next? We cannot allow all of this continue, because if we do, we shall soon live in tyranny. Few Americans today know the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a Boston physician. He lived within walking distance of this building. He was a leading patriot at the beginning of our nation's struggle for independence. On March 6th of 1775, he spoke at the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And that, of course, is when British troops had fired into a crowd of civilians and killed several of them. Joseph Warren knew that a British guard was on its way to arrest him. He spoke over the heads and the fixed bayonets of British redcoats who were standing right in front of him to the crowd behind him. He proceeded to implore his fellow Americans to resist tyranny and to fight for freedom. And some of what he said in 1775 needs to be heard today. He said, "Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are powerful and numerous, but we have many friends determining to be free, and heaven and earth shall aid the resolution." He said, "On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourself. The faltering tongue of hoary age calls upon you to support your country. The lisping infant raises its suppliant hands, imploring defense against the monster slavery. Your fathers look down from the celestial seats with smiling approbation on their sons who boldly stand forth in the cause of virtue. But they sternly frown upon the human miscreant who, to secure the loaves and fishes to himself, would breed a serpent to destroy his children. Dr. Joseph Warren fell mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, right up the street. He didn't live long enough to see his countrymen succeed in the war for independence from Great Britain. We owe something to Dr. Joseph Warren and to all who helped to create this wonderful nation, this greatest experiment in human liberty in all history. Also, as he said, we owe something to the lisping infants who are counting on us to leave to them the country that we inherited with absolutely no effort at all on our part. Our country, the free and independent United States of America. I know you won't stand idly by and let a foul conspiracy destroy it. Therefore, I invite you to redouble your efforts if you are a member of the John Birch Society, and if you are not, to come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And I thank you very much.
The soloist upstairs that has been accompanying most of the evening. Here's the plate in the front. So after you ask Ms. McManus your questions, you can put some money in. You see, when he asked you to pull out the dollar bill, that was a tricky way to raise funds, you see. Okay, I have a couple of assignments for you in the room. I know a lot of you people in the room have already distributed copies of this issue. I know quite a few have been out. If you haven't, I'm urging you to get copies, extra copies. Get them in the hands of your elected officials, your friends, your colleagues, your pastor, your priest, your rabbi, your commander, etc., your boss, people in the neighborhood. Get extra copies, mail them to officials. The John Birch Society is on a campaign right now to get these in the hands of every single state elected official in New England, and where the magazines are there, and some of them have been distributed. The second assignment is to write to your state official and ask him to read this issue. That should be on the desk. We also suggest that you get involved with our program if you're not a member, and we have applications at the back. And another book I'd like to highly recommend is written by John McManus called Changing Commands. And if enough people knew what was happening, we would prevent UN flags flying from the mast of the USS Constitution. Because, no, it's not. That's, well, no, but that's what's in store. This particular issue, they're $1 a piece. 10 for $8, in cases of 100 for 80. I've got 3 cases and a bad back upstairs, so please, I don't want to take any home with me. I can order some for you, have them drop shipped. So again, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank our speaker and all of you who attended. God bless you. Good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me make a quick announcement. I forgot. The program that you've heard tonight has been already made into a video program. It's actually longer than what I gave you. I shortened it, and I know you're very grateful for that. It's going to be available for $20. It's a 2-hour-long program, part 1, part 2, through the John Birch Society. If you're interested in it, it is available. So, and my thanks to you.
You turned it off?
You're on there. Come on, give us a word.